Hello there, everyone. Okay, we're recording. And so hello to those who will be joining us later. I know many people have told me that they watch these recordings afterwards, so I appreciate that. Today, what I have queued up and a short amount of time available is a discussion of Yerba Mansa. Yerba Mansa is one of the most versatile herbs that we have to work with here in the Southwest, and I've thus employed it in a number of our products. You could probably utilize it even more, especially in teas. I just don't have enough access to the herb at this time to do that. But I've queued up a number of those, all of our products actually on the slideshow today to go over the ingredients, highlighting Yerba Mansa in each and the properties of these formulas. So let me share the screen. Okay, and we're rolling. All right, you know who we are and why we're here. Product presentation, empowering individuals to make informed decisions about their health. So I think there's nothing more important other than perhaps your own felt experience that you learn to trust in and follow, and to be informed about what healing agents are at your disposal, should you choose to engage with them. The plants offer a tremendous breadth of opportunity throughout the plant kingdom, anywhere you exist on this planet. And so, in fact, that's what my heretofore called apprenticeship program, Sonoran Herbalist Apprenticeship program, which will be revealed shortly for 2022 as the Bioregional Herbalist Apprenticeship program, seeks to instill in each person, through their own relationship developed with the local plants, which is how Desert Tortoise Botanicals came to be, to seek that healing out through their own relationship with the landscape and the plants therein. So that will be forthcoming, as I mentioned, scheduled for an in-person, predominantly in-person and live field study program, my Bioregional Herbalist Apprenticeship program for next year. Predominantly held in, if not exclusively, in Arizona. But today's purpose is to discuss Yerba Mansa. Yerba Mansa is known by the scientific name Anemopsis californica. Anemopsis meaning that it looks like anemone. So that could be either the plant anemone, which, yes, its inflorescence looks a lot more like that, which is a relative of pulsatilla or pasque flower, which is named after the sea anemone. Californica, because it was first described and discovered in California, but it moves over into Arizona. And you could say Michael Moore described it as two main stands or populations separated by the Sonoran Desert, one being in California along the waterways there, and then along the Rio Grande. So the Rio Grande and Southern California have the largest stands, and then it can extend northward up into Oregon, Colorado, perhaps Utah, and then Southern Nevada. Most of the stands are believed to have been spread by human hands, as the plant can produce predominantly infertile seeds and reproduces vegetatively quite readily. I've established 2 solid stands over the past decade in my gardens, two different gardens, and have potted a number of the plants. And once you give it moisture, it'll take off. And then once established, it can withstand drought in terms of survival, maybe not its, verdancy as in the leaves, but it's a drought resilient plant. I'll call it that is largely dependent on water though for its thriving. So it's found, as I mentioned already, along waterways, but then also in springs. And so seasonal streams, and within gallery riparian forests in the Southwest, where large stands of cottonwoods may pull up moisture from deeper levels and then respirate it out towards the surface through the air. I found Yerba Mansa predominantly in those types of settings here in our immediate area. So as such, it is a highly treasured remedy in the American Southwest. It also goes by another name, Babisa, or Babis. Babis is the autumn name, and it's related closely to another Uru-Aztecan language, the Yaqui or Dueme, and that name signifies water plant. I believe, if I remember correctly, Ba is water, Bis plant, so water, Babis, water plant. Hence, you will find another Spanish name, Babisa. So Babisa is a Españolizado version of the indigenous name. So what's interesting about Yerba Mansa is that it addresses a wide breadth of issues through its application and its affinity for a number of the tissues and organ systems within our body. This could be thus classified as a boy, just totally blanked on the name. There's a term for plants, for herbal remedies that came about through the homeopathic school in the 19th century. And it's on the tip of my tongue, but it'll come back to me. But I'm defining it here nonetheless. So wide number of issues, almost as if you have a formula or a whole apothecary within a single herb and that you can apply it in multiple ways. In this case, both topically and internally. The first folk remedy that I learned on the ground, so to speak, in Sonora from an elder vaquero or cowboy, he told me his mom would use it topically for boils, carbuncles, and hot, damp swellings at the surface of the skin. And I believe that was the root they would poultice fresh, mash it, and apply it topically. The root is more like it's kind of like ginger in the sense that it's a rhizome, but from the rhizome, the mature rhizome will sprout numerous rootlets that are spaghetti-like in nature. So when the plant is young, all of the roots are spaghetti-like, and then those start to develop and form into the rhizomatous structures. And so those can colonize and fully establish themselves in an area such that I believe what's most important at that point at junctures along its growth and development is that people jump in and disturb the soil and gather it, and that spurs the plant on to more growth. So, this is a plant that United Plant Savers adopted in a sense over the past decade to highlight the habitat loss that this plant is facing. It can't really grow without water. I use irrigation to grow it. And so it's going to only grow in our environment that has been experiencing drought for the better part of 40 years. And thus its habitat's been diminishing. But in regards to people, keeping Yerba Mansa off limits and not touching and not engaging, I think it kind of goes against the entire historical relationship between humans and how we spread it. Generally speaking, we as people on the earth spread it across this region, and then would frequently, cyclically, seasonally go into those patches, disturb it, dig some up, and utilize it, thus invigorating regeneration and regrowth. So I'm generally speaking, by and large, vast majority of plants, that's going to be my approach, is that we must maintain engagement with them and not take a hands-off approach. So if there's concerns of anyone listening, or you come across those concerns, I think a degree of concern is warranted. We don't want to go with backhoes and completely obliterate and pave over these grounds where Yerba Mansa is growing. I'm all for helping mitigate that. But to say that humans shouldn't be digging it, or shouldn't be used, or shouldn't be sold, I think that's going way too far. Anyhow, that's just a quick social political editorial there on the use of plants. But additionally, another thing I didn't mention is that, both acute and chronic conditions. So wide degree of applications for Yerba Mansa. So one of the products that we have, or the product that we offer that's an exclusive or a specific as just the plant itself, Yerba Mansa, is the tincture. Now, traditionally, people have been accustomed to using the plant fresh or dried, topically as a poultice, or made into a tea, then applied as a fomentation, or the tea is drunk, or people soak in it, whatever the case may be. So I don't know how long tinctures have been used, but it's the primary way I would say I've been using Yerba Mansa for the past decade and a half plus. And so some of the main qualities of Yerba Mansa is that it's warm and dry. Energetically, that means that as a warming plant, it has capacity to, you could say, stimulate blood flow and move energy out towards the surface. It promotes flow. Dry in the sense that its net effect will be to reduce excessive moisture or dampness in the tissue. And so that's those qualities there can be useful in assessing how we apply certain herbs, or perhaps how we apply specific herbs in terms of a powder, a wash, a tincture, an oil, a salve. And then flavor-wise, astringent and pungent are the two main flavors. And then you can occasionally find salty. In fact, stands that I've gathered from can be quite salty, and then bitter on occasion, but it's a mild bitterness. So the astringent is common throughout, in my experience, wherever the stand is and whatever part of the plant, both the leaf and the root. And thus it lends itself quite well to tonifying and tightening tissue structure. And then pungent, that is a consistent quality that exists on a spectrum from mild, very, very mild to more pronounced. And therefore you're going to get more or less of that warming, diffusive, energizing quality. So I'll try to address that as we go through some of these applications where some of those qualities are more suitable or going to bring us more or less of the effect we're looking at. Okay, so some of the top properties I decided to just list here as references. And of course, you're always welcome to screenshot these if you find this helpful, but alterative. So that's an old time herbalist term that you don't see very much. People might think it's a misspelling, that it means alternative. No, it's alterative and alterative altering. So it's an herb that, generally speaking, has the capacity to alter the body's ability to detoxify itself and or enhance nutrient absorption. The two main ways you could say, the light and the dark of maintaining health is deriving nutrients from whatever we ingest or exposed to, and then utilizing those nutrients in an effective way to maintain tissue health, integrity, restoration, and detoxification. So it's the building and the building up of healthy tissue, and you could say the relieving of the waste from the body from deteriorated or wasted or destroyed tissue. So it's the both ends of that, that an alternative herb is meant to support that. Another classic alternative could be red clover. It's also mild. And you could say one of the top qualities of Yerba Mansa is that it tones the mucous membranes. And so therefore it's used very commonly as a remedy for the sinuses. And that's why we have it in the hay fever formula. But I would say just about any occurrence that, again, acute or chronic, that affects the sinuses, I would apply Yerba Mansa. One of the ways that I experienced that early on, I remember going into deep into the White Mountains in a special place that I would retreat to each summer. And I went there with about $40 to my name and some food to get through the week and enough herbs to keep me busy. And there was somebody in the, actually a campground host in a section of this remote campground. And I got to talk with her and her husband one evening, and she revealed to me that she hadn't slept through the night in, I forget how many years. It was at least 6 or 7, might have even been double digits. She said that she had a postnasal drip that would almost, ritually wake her up each night to gain her attention again. So I said, you've been dealing with this a long time, but there's this herb Yerba Mansa. It's great for such things, and the sinuses, maybe you want to try it, see if it helps at all. So I gave her a bottle of tincture that I had, and happened to check in with her the next day, and she was so excited to tell me that she had slept through the night for the first time in years. And I think I was just as astounded as she was, if not more so, because I wasn't expecting such a result, but it played out as it did. So I never make guarantees, but I do believe in the possibility for amazing things to happen. So that's just a little anecdotal story to help you remember what Yerba Mansa can do for the sinuses. And as a lymphagogue, i.e. an herb that helps promote the movement of the lymph system, which is, it's the watery void of the body. It's a vague idea in terms of rational, reductive, scientific thought around our physiology, certainly in the 21st century. It was identified, I believe, in the late 17th century. And in terms of conventional knowledge and how it's taught in schools to doctors and so forth, not much developed in terms of in-depth knowledge on the lymph system. I would say that herbalists might receive correspondingly to the number of hours of education that an average herbalist gets in a school for herbalism, relatively more, maybe 5 times, 10 times the amount of education around the lymph system than a doctor would. Again, relative to the amount of time they spend. Doctors don't spend that much time learning about it. Lymphedema is lymphadenopathy, and then also lipedema, which is related to fats. Those were new issues coming out a decade or so ago, and most doctors were largely ignorant of it because it just is not part of their education, at least in school. But Yerba Mansa, along with red root, a couple of herbs I wrote about, I think, in a blog post not too long ago, are 2 very important herbs for helping to move the lymph system. Now, Yerba Mansa, I would call it more general in its effects on the lymph system and maybe not so active and reliable as red root is, but perhaps more subtle as a consequence. And it moves fluids in general without such an affinity for the lymph. Whereas we could talk about mucus, which lines the, ideally would be present in the respiratory, digestive, and genitourinary tract. So therefore, you have an application with Yerba Mansa whenever there's a disturbance in the mucosa of all of those systems I just mentioned. So again, highlighting how Yerba Mansa can be so widely applicable. It also has qualities that lend it to being a digestive remedy as well, being anti-inflammatory, i.e. pain relieving in the gut, as well as being carminative. Now, this is where the more pungent varieties, I believe, and perhaps somewhat bitter, but certainly pungent varieties are going to be, you know, more in line with these properties as gut anti-inflammatory carminity. And then to some extent that overlaps with intestinal tonic, but that's also where the astringent mucous membrane toning qualities are. So somebody with a very boggy, damp intestinal environment tend towards loose stools and or very slow transit time. Could also be constipation, but could be long-standing phlegm in the intestinal tract, enough so that heat develops, and that could be slow and sluggish evacuation, but also heat present. So heat can mean excitation and rapid movement, but it also can be a consequence of lingering toxins, and that builds up a toxic heat. And that's where ulcers can start to develop, and perhaps polyps and cancerous growth. It's the concept of ama within Ayurvedic medicine, whereas toxins linger and accumulate and congeal, become more entrenched, and therefore less vital force, chi, blood flow is moving through them, i.e. fewer nutrients are arriving to that area, and toxic waste products are hanging around longer. All of that just adds up to increased tendency towards illness without putting a specific label on it. And then my philosophy would be then how that manifests in each individual is dependent upon their mental, emotional, spiritual, genetic picture, and how their, you could say, their mental, emotional, spiritual makeup at that moment will condition how their genetic blueprint is expressed, i.e. epigenetics. So that's just a quick synopsis on dampness and accumulation of toxins, and how Yerba Mansa can be useful in facilitating movement through there, especially in those tissues where the mucous membranes line the surface, or the surfaces are lined with mucous membranes, i.e. respiratory tract, digestive tract, and genitourinary. And then circling back around to some of the topical applications, as I mentioned, you know, you can apply it topically for hot, damp conditions, any wounds or infected areas, as well as fungal infections. You can apply Yerba Mansa topically. So we have it in our sensitive areas salve, which is a salve that's made with lower beeswax content. So it's a softer, smoother application. It was cleverly named the hemorrhoid salve at one point, but that is not as attractive of a name, even as explicit as it is. And it also makes a claim. So I had to remove that and change it. And I think sensitive areas it's even a little more apt, because it could be applied to other tender tissues that are sensitive for whatever reason. So it has pain relieving qualities as well as anti-infective qualities, this salve, as well as the Yerba Mansa in that regard. That's not something I mentioned here aside from being anti-inflammatory to the gut, but Yerba Mansa is a pain relieving herb that has traditional use for joint pain or arthritis, both topically and internally. In fact, there was an article written, I forget what it was, Women's Day, one of the major magazines you would see at the, you know, checkout the grocery store a couple of years ago, and someone decided to feature Yerba Mansa from Desert Tortoise Botanicals in Women's Day magazine, you know, just a little, you know, 2-inch by 3-inch blurb there in the magazine. And so, you know, the ceiling blew off for a couple of months in our Yerba Mansa tincture sales, because everyone wanted it for arthritis. I would guess that it maybe worked for, you know, 20-25% of the people that tried it, not because Yerba Mansa only works sometimes, but because maybe other underlying issues weren't addressed and the vitality wasn't there to match what Yerba Mansa had to offer. Okay, so moving on to yeah, I was hoping to wrap up by noon today. I'll see what I can do to get through the few formulas, products that we have here. So our cold and flu formula had to be renamed because it makes a claim. And so I renamed it to immune formula. As you've noticed, it still says on the image, cold and flu formula on the website, and our labeling is still the same. I just don't have time to change all that. So sorry for any confusion, if there is any. But the ingredients of this, so this is a blend that came out of almost exclusively wild harvested plants, except for the licorice root. And it's been a great formula. It works fantastic for a variety of respiratory illnesses, let's just call it. And Yerba Mansa is there in many of the ways that I just mentioned, but I would say it's mucous membrane effects and it's warming. It lends something to the warming diffusive, but its ability to enhance detoxification is a key role here. So in that regard, enhancing detoxification can be important up front as a means of warding off illness, i.e. giving yourself more depth to deal with whatever onslaught of toxicity may be upon you. And then also the recovery phase. So Yerba Mansa is really good in preventative, acute, and recovery. That's another important point to make. Not all of these herbs here are excellent for recovery, but if you're utilizing the formula broadly or widely, as I expect these formulas to be used, they're not exceptionally specific for a specific group of people. I've tried to make them as accessible as possible and as sustainable as possible, and that we could continue to make them to the extent that people need them, and they would have the broadest beneficial effect over the widest group of people. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, that is a formula that I will reach for when I have that sort of immunological perturbance happening. For me, it's a sore throat often, and a feeling of slight feverishness. And so I've had that up until about yesterday over the past week. And so I was using Yerba Mansa. I was also using Bidens, which Michael Moore spoke of as a replacement for Yerba Mansa. Interestingly enough, now I think of Yerba Mansa more as a replacement for Bidens because I can access it a bit more easily than the Bidens. But nonetheless, as he saw them as similar in relationship to the mucous membrane toning effects. There's a lot more that Bidens does, including helping to protect red blood cells. And that's why it's in my CV3 formula. And I'd be remiss to not mention that every time I have to have a chance to tell people how important that is, right now, especially. Okay, so moving on to the next one, slightly different terrain here, but ties into what I was saying earlier about clearing the toxins. Yerba Mansa also has properties that has antifungal properties. So as do all the herbs in this formula. So I made this formula sort of as an exercise to see if I could achieve what I was just saying I intend to achieve with my formulas, because antifungal herbs can be kind of harsh. So that's why you see the walnut hulls and the cedar leaves and the cypress towards the end of the formulation. Those comprise maybe collectively about 30% of the formula, whereas desert willow, calendula, and Yerba Mansa comprise the remaining 2/3. And so Yerba Mansa and calendula are, in all cases, I would say, quite genteel, and desert willow can be, but it's certainly its flavor, its taste is a bit more intense. But I think energetically that plant is quite motherly and genteel as well. So those comprise the bulk of that. What I have found with this formula, what's born out of practice over decades of use, is that this can be very useful for damp lung conditions. And believe it or not, that does happen here in the desert because we are multidimensional beings. Things act on us at the surface, but then because they're multidirectional as well, because underneath things could be moving in a different direction, or have a different energy underneath, while the surface environmental influences are 180 degrees different. So it can be hot and dry out here, but people have a lingering dampness that's held deep within the lungs that could either hold something such as coccidiomycosis, hold it within the system and not allow it to be cleared, or even be festering to some extent, especially if someone's accustomed to eating cold, damp foods on a daily basis, even when we're in our hottest, driest time. So there's multiple environmental factors that can influence that. But what I've seen is that people who came to this area and suddenly developed fatigue and cough, and this is, I'm talking about, going back a decade or more, and they tried this formula, assuming that it could be valley fever. This relaxed the cough and helped improve their overall quality of being, enhancing their fatigue and stamina. So this does seem to have a positive effect on valley fever. Valley fever is endemic to some areas in the Southwest where there's extensive large-scale agriculture, continual digging up of the earth, and creating a lot of pulverized material go up into the air. And those who are susceptible, pulling that in, trigger something within the endothelial lining of the lungs, or the epithelium, I should say, of the lungs, and can initiate an inflammatory response and perhaps, presumably, allow for a degree of fungal growth when that's not an appropriate place for the fungal growth in the lungs. And thus the situation can degrade from there. So if we're talking about full healing, I don't know if that happens with this formula or if that has happened with anyone, but I would guess that adequate vitamin D status, or abundant, I should start saying now more often, abundant vitamin D status could be essential in transforming that as well. So that's the antifungal, drain the swamp. And then hay fever formula, another one of my old formulas that's comprised, again, almost exclusively of local plants, with the exception, again, of licorice root. Licorice root is a nice harmonizer, and I generally use it at 5% or less in these formulations. I would say not the best herb for males, generally speaking, as it could inhibit testosterone uptake. And that's an issue given the estrogenic compounds that are circulating at a relatively, I think, high abundance in our environment historically. So I don't advocate long-term use of licorice for males, but this is in a relatively small amount. So I think there's less of a threat, certainly, to put it a certain way. But I just want to mention that. But Yerba Mansa here addresses those things that I've been talking about in terms of tonifying the mucous membranes, but it also, as I mentioned in that story, the one with the postnasal drip, can dry that up. Could also have an effect at the eyes. Brittle bush is a great herb, as is canyon bursage or other bursage or ambrosia species. Even estaffiate can be really good for drying up the sinuses. But interestingly enough, brittle bush can contribute to drying up the runny eyes, but then also conversely can help bring back moisture, a sense of moistness to the eyes. It's not by putting it in the eye, it's by taking it orally, but witnessed that numerous times, not just in myself, but in many people who take it, that it helps bring back proper lubrication to the eyes, or at least it can. And what's also unique and interesting about this formula is that it's not just classic dry agents like eye bright. With Yerba Mansa, for example, and as well as the estaffiate and grapefruit and licorice root, we're enhancing the detoxification process, which is going to be necessary when you have a large histaminic response or whatever other type of immunological response that's resulting in the hay fever as a symptom. because that's going to be the background noise that either exacerbates the hay fever, or if those expressions from the tissue are suppressed enough, could begin to manifest in deeper ways, i.e. earaches and possibly headaches and throat congestion and infections in the throat, and maybe even deeper inflammatory effects in the lungs. So this formula, I believe, is a nice balance between allaying the symptoms while supporting from the background what is necessary to clear through the toxins, i.e. the immunological complexes that your body creates in response to the perceived threat, i.e. the pollen or whatever it may be, to clear that from the body and not just focus superficially at, oh, my nose is running, I want to get rid of that. Okay, yeah, let's do that, but then let's also help calm and soften the liver, because it's been really excited to make all these products, these immunological products, and that's where the estaffiate and grapefruit come in. And let's help clear the lymph. You know, Yerba Mansa comes in there. So this is, I believe, a pretty well-balanced formula. Gum rinse, yet another one where Yerba Mansa leads off. I would say perhaps ideally we'd use just the root of the Yerba Mansa, but I've been making whole plant tincture now for several years. The root is just a bit more astringent, but there's plenty of other astringent herbs in this formula, i.e. the limberbush and the cremeria or ratney, that help tonify the gums really well. The thought of chewing on limberbush almost gives me the shivers for how astringent that it is. I remember an elder from the Autumn people telling me years ago how if you had loose teeth that they would dig up that root and chew on it. And I just can't even imagine doing such a thing. But yeah, if your teeth are loose, that's an indication of arguably an imbalanced flora within the mouth that's attacking the gums. So this is kind of a, you could say, a superficial remedy, but in terms of those astringent herbs. But this formulation as a whole is meant to address specific organisms that might be prolific when the pH is imbalanced. So ultimately, you want to get the proper nutrients there and do a degree of proper cleaning so as to not provide the environmental conditions or the ecology in which those organisms can thrive. It's not that the organisms are bad so much as that you've given them, you know, that's what you're growing, you know, as a result of the environmental conditions within the mouth. So that's why the white sage and the hop leaf are in there. Hop bush, totally unrelated, but at the same time, I've been considering adding that as well, primarily since I've been having a hard time getting to the hop leaf in the mountains the last couple of years, because hop bush also is shown effective against Streptococcus mutans, which is one of the organisms implicated in dental caries. So again, multifaceted formula. The Yerba Mansa is going to help serve, tone, and tighten. It's also going to be anti-inflammatory and antiseptic and contribute to analgesic properties as well. Yarrow root is probably my #1 pain reliever or analgesic for toothache. Unless the toothache, you know, is just a rotten tooth that's on its dying days, you can get a long way with yarrow root. I've seen people miserable. You know, for example, a woman standing at the farmer's market at her booth, a face of a toothache, the medication's not working, and I pull out some yarrow root tincture. Desperate to try anything, they relinquish and say, sure, I'll give it a try. And then 15 minutes later, I look over and she's beaming to tell me how great she feels and the pain is gone. It's just numbed out. So yarrow can be really fantastic, either taken as a tincture or, as I learned from Michael Moore, where he just stumbled upon it in some, you know, like an old dime store or something like that, 5 and dime in Arkansas. And they had a dusty jar of the root, a jar with roots of yarrow soaking in brandy. And he inquired about it, and they said that's a toothache remedy. So you would take the root out and you chew on it. But of course, they're making a tincture, and so you could also take that liquid and swish it around, and that works fantastic as well. So a little bit added knowledge there. But sensitive area salve, which I've already mentioned, this is going to be, I didn't get around to finishing the properties section there, but this is pain relieving. It's soothing because of the olive oil, certainly, and the beeswax, but it's pain relieving and going to be toning and tightening to the tissues. Añil de Muerto, that's a wild harvested plant. It's a classic for hot, irritated tissues. One of those traditions that, were it not for Michael Moore, probably would have died out. I hadn't learned that anywhere else, either in the literature that I can recall or with people that I learned from locally. So I was thankful to learn that. It's an abundant sunflower family plant here for topical use for red irritated tissue. So that's our sensitive area salve, and the Yerba Mansa leaf. Again, fantastic whenever there's hot, damp, irritated tissues, which is not uncommon for hemorrhoids, piles, and the like. So you can be creative and apply this in other ways. Desert tobacco's in there for pain relief. So the sensitive area salve, we have carrying 3 sizes. It's getting harder and harder to keep our 4-ounce salves in stock because people are turning on to our salves, and so they realize that they're going to be using it frequently, or they want to get the best value. So we're selling out at a rate of the 4-ounce salves that in 6 months, which used to take 5 or 6 years to sell that many. So hopefully I can keep up with the demand, since still this is one of the product lines where a vast majority of what we use is wild harvested and not available commercially. Okay, so to wrap up, yeah, if anyone at any time is ever compelled to make a donation in appreciation for what I'm sharing, if it's brought value to your life, you're welcome. No donation is too small, and all are accepted with gratitude. Thank you for your consideration there. And I also want to mention, for those who aren't aware, I do offer quick consultations for people with very individualized interests and concerns. Either 15 or 30-minute sessions are available to book directly on the website. There's an app that sets up a schedule. You can select, I think, by 5-minute time increments within the available windows on the days that are available. You can find it in the drop-down menu, or just search quick consultations, and it'll bring up the 2 products, and you can choose one of the other 15 or 30-minute sessions. Some who have engaged already with me for those 15, 30-minute sessions, which almost always go much longer than that, have inquired about doing longer sessions. And I do that. It's not something I have advertised on any of my websites at this point, but if you're interested, you can email me, and I have a PDF of offerings. I call them wellness consultations, and they run from an hour to a few hours, and package deals of multiple at a time with email support, ongoing email support, and so forth. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. I can give you more information. Email is always the best way to contact me. So I think that wraps it up for today. Hopefully you found that interesting and useful on Yerba Mansa. If you're almost anywhere in the West, I think you could pull off introducing Yerba Mansa to your garden space. Just consider that space Yerba Mansa's and Yerba Mansa's alone, as it will infiltrate and take over. So I have mine in a contained area right now. I'd like that contained area to be bigger, but it was already set up. So, and it doesn't drain very well, which is great for it. It'll hold that moisture for a while. So basins that don't drain well can be a great place to create your little Yerba Mansa garden. And that way it'll still try to travel elsewhere because it sends its own runners. But anyhow, I think even at higher elevations and further north, it will survive winters, and you'll be rewarded with having that easily accessible in your garden. Where to get that, I'm not quite sure. I only know locally Desert Survivors in Tucson. For anyone who ever may be here locally, you can find it there. And I have not looked online as to where you might buy starts of it, but that would be a place, that would be a way to start. Anamopsis starts or Yerba Mansa starts, maybe even through strictly medicinal seeds. I don't know. Over in Oregon, worth a shot. Anyhow, gotta run. Thanks for your time, for joining me, and I'll see you next Thursday. Bye-bye.